I have been pretty vocal about the fact that Soos isn't really my favorite Gravity Falls character. Not to say that I don't like the guy, he's really funny. I just have a hard time taking him seriously because he doesn't really do much. That said, despite that I do like him, I do want to hammer that point home. I never really felt like I needed an episode centered on him in his life. So you can imagine I was a little disappointed when I saw the title of Gravity Falls Season 2, Episode 5, Soos and the Real Girl, making the correct assumption that this was going to be a Soos-centric episode. I resolved to keep an open mind and try to enjoy this episode, and I have to say that even in spite of that, I was still very pleasantly surprised by this episode. I think I still would have been, even if I hadn't, let's say, braced myself for it. The episode starts out with the cast literally asking the question of whether or not any of them have ever wondered what Soos does after he goes home for the day, and utter a pretty resounding no, which I thought was funny. And we get to see about what we expect. He hangs out with his grandma, who we have met, and plays video games. He seems like the kind of person who would have that kind of life. His grandmother, however, wants him to get on with his life. She's not going to be around forever, and she'd like to see him meet a nice girl and maybe even get married before she's gone. She asks him to try to find a date by, I think it was his cousin's engagement party at the end of the week. So effectively he has 1 week to meet a girl. But Soos is, how to put this nicely, he is not quite of above average intelligence, has virtually no foresight, and literally no filter. So of course his attempts to talk to someone, to flirt with someone, are disastrous. And he ends up enlisting the help of Dipper and Mabel, who couldn't be more excited because she's Mabel. Of course she would want to help fix him up. They go to the mall because there are plenty of women to meet at the mall. Things go about as poorly as they did back at the Mystery Shack, but Soos does eventually stumble upon a dating simulator, one of those Japanese games that were really popular on people's gaming channels for a while, and ends up buying it thinking it will teach him how to date. He plugs in the game, and he doesn't realize at first, but the female character in the game, the one he's supposed to be romancing, is actually sentient and is even able to follow him out of the game into other electronics, which she does after Dipper and Mabel come and get him again to take him back to the mall to try a second time. She actually appears to him there, and they kind of go on a little date in the real world, sort of. And it's while they're on this quote-unquote date that Soos draws the attention of the girl who runs the Meet Cute, meat as in the food, snack kiosk. She finds Soos charming and funny for the very reason that he does just kind of do whatever he thinks is fun, whatever he thinks is enjoyable. And without Soos even really realizing what's happening, they end up setting up a date to go to the Gravity Falls in-universe equivalent to Chuck E. Cheese. Soos attempts to break it off with the video game character. Her name was Giffany, I think. And the girl he met at the mall was Melanie. Sorry, I'm really bad with names. Gotta remind myself every so often. He tries to break it up with Giffany, but she ends up following him to the mall again, possesses the animatronics, and then the rest of the episode basically just devolves into FNAF. Though I will admit that Soos gets a couple of really heroic moments in there, and even Melanie gets one. She ends up destroying one of the animatronics, which was pretty badass. Dipper and Mabel, meanwhile, did practically nothing. An intentional role reversal between the two of them and Soos, or just subpar writing? You decide. Soos does destroy the game, which somehow destroys Giffany even though she's not in the game anymore. I don't really get that, but it worked, so whatever. And there is a subplot involving Stan and, to a lesser extent, Wendy, but I just didn't really find it interesting, so I don't care. It doesn't amount to anything anyway. Overall, though, I enjoyed this episode. It's not one that I'm going to write home about. It's not like one of the best of the series or anything, but it did a really good job for what it was. Rather than tell a story about Dipper or Dipper and Mabel with a supernatural twist, they told a story about Soos with a supernatural twist. And keeping in mind that this was an episode about Soos, they played to Soos's strengths in the narrative. The episode was primarily comedy-driven. Even the stuff with Giffany never really felt all that serious, and instead felt more like they were poking fun at people who obsess too much over video games and don't live their real lives. I think what it boils down to is this was a Soos story in the more serious of the two seasons of the show. And it worked, without forgetting what makes Soos a character on a fundamental level. Soos is the comedy relief, and so this episode was a bit of a comedy relief episode. Even the stuff with Stan and Wendy, even though it didn't really amount to anything, was still funny and amusing. It felt more like one of the Stan plots from the first season more than anything, which kind of annoyed me, but still, it wasn't bad or anything. It just didn't really interest me that much. Which is really weird for me to say, that something that Stan did at this point in the show didn't interest me, and yet something that Soos did. Just feels really backwards, you know? I liked Melanie. It doesn't look like she's going to be a recurring character. She says that she's moving away, but she does want to keep in touch with Soos, so who knows, she might be in the show again. I wouldn't be opposed to that. I'll tell you who I do want to see more of, though, and that's Soos's grandma. She's absolutely hysterical. Whereas Soos doesn't really have a filter, his grandma doesn't really have any boundaries. And just so long as they never try to take that too seriously, I can't imagine a scenario where she wouldn't add a little bit of comic relief to whatever episode she's in. Again, this episode isn't anything to write home about, but still a perfectly enjoyable episode of this show. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to ask, what did you think of this episode if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.